If you would, please pray with me. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in us the fire of your love, and send forth your Spirit, and we shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. My friends, I don't know if you know this about me, but when I get excited about something, I really get excited about something. I went to Monsignor and I'm like, I'm so excited to start this series. I'm going to preach for an hour. And he said, you will not be a priest for very long. But I want you to pay attention for just a few minutes. I'm very ADD, so I get it. I can be very squirrely. But I want you to lock in with me for a few minutes. You see, one of the things that is so awesome about what we get to experience is every 3 years we get to hear from John chapter 6. And every 3 years it sneaks up on every priest, and they give all their material in the first week, and they're left with nothing for the last 4. So what's beautiful about this is that's not going to happen. We have a plan. What I want to do is I want to dive into the Mass. I want to dive into the Eucharist. I want to dive into the whole purpose of what John 6 is trying to teach, what it's trying to convey, what it's trying to show. And the reason is I don't know if you know this, but we're in the process of having a giant Eucharistic revival within our nation. As I said earlier before Mass began, I was just in a stadium with 50,000 of Catholics throughout all of our country, and it was awesome. But one of the things that came out of that is this desire to bring to the world and bring to our nation and bring to our parishes a reconnection with what happens at Mass. Now, if I were to ask you, how many of you are cradle Catholics? Would you please raise your hand? Awesome. I bet I could ask you any question about what happens here at Mass since you've been growing up with it, and you could answer it, right? Probably not. How many of you are converts? How many of you could answer every question I could have? Probably more than the cradle Catholics. Probably more than the cradle Catholics. I want to set the stage here for a minute. I want to talk about my own experience, and I'll get to the reason why. I don't know if you know this, but I wasn't born a priest. I didn't just fall out of heaven. Trust me, my parents would attest to that. My whole life, I was a cradle Catholic, grew up coming to Mass, leaving the church, left the church twice, that's a whole different story. But every time I'd come to Mass, I was so bored. There'd be a priest up there who I'd either barely understand or would just give this boring sermon that had nothing to do with my life. Father, great, I'm glad that you're a representative of Jesus, that's awesome. I don't know what are you doing? Sit down. This is honesty. This is where I was at. I'll tell you, I used to sit in the back. Nobody could be more in the back than me. I actually tried to become part of the wall because I was fulfilling an obligation, but it didn't really mean anything to me. It was all about just, I have to do this, otherwise I'd have that awesome Catholic guilt that I've come to love as a priest. But it didn't really change anything for me because it didn't really mean anything. I would come, I would experience, I would listen to some readings, I'd hear a homily that was generally meh, and then I would receive the Lord, whatever that meant, and then I would go home and be on my way. Day in and day out, week in and week out. When I started to discern priesthood, I was really concerned, mostly because he was asking me to. But as I started off in seminary, the whole time I was like, Father, I can understand. God, I could see myself celebrating the sacraments. I would love to baptize children. I would love to celebrate the sacrament of confession. I would love to be on that side of the confessional and be able to see your mercy change somebody's life. I would love to be there to anoint somebody when they're ill and sick. I would love to be there to celebrate a wedding. I would love to be there and do these sacraments. But the one that I didn't like, because this is honesty, is I had no real desire to celebrate the Mass. That's a hard thing to admit. Here is a man who was in seminary, training to become a priest, praying to follow the Lord, wanting to give my life over to him. And I'm like, I don't want to do the one thing that you're asking me to do every day because I found it boring. It didn't mean anything to me. My friends, the Lord gave me one of the greatest gifts he could ever have given me. And it came in a way that I never imagined. Over the first few months of my priesthood, I fell in love with celebrating the Mass. I fell in love with the reality that happens day in and day out, week in, week out. I fell in love with the very thing that at first I thought was so boring. And so the part of this whole thing, just to contextualize it, is the one thing I have to give you is my own heart. The one thing I have to give you as a priest is my own knowledge, my own walk, my own relationship with the Lord, in hopes that it gives you the freedom to acknowledge your own relationship with him. So, with that being said, I want you to think about the gospel we just heard about. I want you to imagine yourself in this field. You're surrounded by 5,000 people. I just came from a thing with 2,000 teenagers. I am crazy. But here are 2,000 teenagers. Here are about 1,000 of us. Imagine 5,000 people up on a hill. Jesus is coming. He's followed by his entourage of apostles. And everybody's like, oh, this must be really cool. I've heard about this man. He's done some healings. He's done some teachings. I just want to hear what he has to say. So Jesus up on the hill probably sits down in the place of teaching and begins to teach all of those that came out to listen. Now, unlike what Monsignor threatened me with, he probably talked for a long time. So much so that the humanity of people started to arise. You know what, Jesus, that's a great message. I wish I could receive it, but I'm really hungry right now. People are starting to get hungry. And now you can take this in a couple different ways. You can take this in the physical sense, the natural human sense. We get hungry. If I were to ask how many of you have breakfast reservations, don't raise your hand. It's a real reality. But then there's also the spiritual reality, the hunger that starts to stir within us when we hear and listen to the Lord. This desire for more, this desire for something to come from the words, this desire for action, this desire to be known, something starts to stir. And so here is Jesus and his apostles. And his apostles are probably starting to murmur, Jesus, these people are getting restless. I know you have great messages. Yeah, you're the Son of God. You're going to reveal that. That's great and all. But like these people are hungry. And it's not just for you. So what does Jesus do? Jesus looks at Philip, and I love the humor of the scriptures. God's humor is way more humorous than we give him credit. And he looks at Philip and he goes, how do you think we're going to feed them? Imagine Philip for the moment. Just put yourself in that situation. Here is the Lord who can do anything, and he looks at you and says, how are you going to deal with it? You're Jesus. You deal with it. And Philip goes, there's not enough money in the world to feed all these 5,000 people. I don't know when the last time you went to a wedding is, or the worse, fathers, the last time you had to pay for a wedding. Catering is expensive. Jesus, what do you mean? We don't have that kind of money. We don't have that kind of time. We don't have cars. How do you want us to feed them? And then what happens? Andrew, the brother of Peter, I have no doubt was probably kind of looking out into the crowd, and he probably saw someone, and he saw a little boy who was probably getting ready to eat his snack because he was smart enough to bring something. And for this purpose, I'm going to call this little boy Jake because Jake is one of my altar servers, so we're just going to put him in the story. And so imagine little Jake, and he's there, and he's got his little snack, and everybody else is looking at him with those hungry eyes. I want what you have. And he's just like, but it's mine. But imagine for a moment, Andrew goes through the crowd. He goes up to that little boy, and he says, I need what you have. That little boy is going to be like, I don't know about you, but every little kid I've ever met, when I've asked for something, they're like, absolutely not. Jake, you wouldn't do that, right? Yeah, I didn't think so. But absolutely not, because this is mine. This is what I want. This is what I need. What do you mean you're asking me for it? But imagine this for a moment. Imagine Andrew kneels down and looks at this little boy and says, I know you need it. I know it's yours, and I know you're terrified to let go of it. But the master has asked for it. Will you trust him? Now imagine for a moment that Andrew leads this little boy to Jesus, and Jesus says, will you trust me with what you have? Will you trust me? And I have no doubts that this little boy was reluctant to hand to him everything that represented his safety, his security, his life. Something so small and insignificant. Have no doubt this little boy would have understood, what do you mean this little thing is going to do something for all of these people? Because what I have to offer you, Master, is something so small. But imagine Jesus looks at him and says, trust me and watch what I'm able to do. My friends, when we bring something to the Lord, no matter how insignificant, in the hands of the Savior, it becomes something profoundly abundant. Profoundly abundant. At every Mass, we have an opportunity to partake in what just took place on that hill. You know, this whole series talking about the Mass, you would think I would start at the very beginning, the sign of the cross, and go linearly through the Mass. But the whole point is, I want to start with the offertory. I want to start with what happens here right after the prayers of the faithful, where so many of us, where myself included, was like, awesome, Catholic intermission. I can go to the bathroom, I can read the bulletin, I can avoid the collection, I can do all of the things because Father's just setting the table and we'll come back here in a few moments. It wasn't until becoming a priest that I understood what is taking place. I want to share this with you because it's something that powerfully moved in my own heart as a priest, and I hope it powerfully moves in yours. Here's the question. What do you bring when you come to this place? What do you bring? Because so often we as Catholics are in the routine of the obligation, but we're not in here for the relationship of the person. So often we just come, we sit down, we just engage with as little possibility or little active as possible. But what do you bring? What are you offering? What are you asking of the Lord? This offertory, this point where the community brings forward from you out there, brings forward wine and bread brought to the priest as the representative of Jesus to offer the very thing that you as a community bring back to God the Father and saying, take this insignificant thing, the little thing that we have to offer you, and make something of it. The bread and the wine are not just the gifts that are brought forward. It's your prayers, it's your worries, it's your doubts, it's your frustrations, it's your desires. It's what we do for the poor and for our community in the world. These things are all represented as we come forward and place it on the altar, where I as the priest have the joy and the privilege to take your offering, not somebody else's, but yours, and say, God the Father, receive this. The same way that Jesus offered each and every one of us back to God the Father on the cross and said, Father, receive them. I make myself an offering for you. Two final things. I want you to close your eyes for a minute for me. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I want you to really think about this for just a moment. How many of you feel anxious about the future? How many of you feel frustrated with your state in life? How many of you feel like you're failing as a parent or a grandparent or a son or a daughter? How many of you have ever felt alone and unworthy? How many of you feel like sometimes life would be better without you? How many of you sometimes doubt that God really cares? How many of you wonder if you really matter? My friends, I want to encourage you for a moment with just the true virtue of courage. That if you answered yes to any of that, I want you to raise your hand. I want you to raise your hand. Raise it high. And with your eyes open, I want you to look around with these hands raised. I want you to see that you have a lot to bring to this Mass. You have a lot to bring to the Lord. And you're not alone in those things that you struggle with. You're not alone in those areas where you think you've fallen short, because we all need the Lord, and we're all asking God for something. My friends, at every offertory, we bring forward our prayers. We bring forward our desires. We bring forward our worries. And we ask God to take them, to take something human, something tiny, something insignificant, something that we sometimes feel that God doesn't care about because it's so little in our own life. And what does the Master do? Is he makes it super abundant, because he doesn't play games with your offering, and he doesn't play games with you. As we go throughout this time, enter into Mass in a new way, into a relational way, not just out of a sense of obligation, but out of a sense of meeting the one who meets you. My friends, the Father has many gifts to bestow upon you, and it starts with what we bring. It starts with our offering. So what do you bring this morning? What do you bring to every Mass? What do you bring to this altar?